maybe not yet. Maybe it hadn't yet been put on the list.
No,
yeah.
I want to get to the DEP and the census, and that should be on the front page. So I can one click on it and do that.
I couldn't find the directory of we ended up calling the main number.
Well, yeah, because it's down.
Okay, testing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. How's that level going up and down? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Okay, that looks pretty good. Let's go up a little bit more. Okay, Bill Mitchell, you're online. We can see. Can you hear me? I know, isn't this great? Sometimes we know who's watching. Bill Mitchell is watching. No, what are we up to? Like 12, 14 people? 10. 10.
We lost a couple.
Right, wrong. This is not as much fun as we thought it was going to be.
You don't think we're going viral?
Not quite yet. Yeah, I was talking to one of my sons the other night about actually this really cool thing that we have on our web pages. For those of you who do permits, well, yes, there are a number of really cool things. But one of the things that's come up recently, we're struggling with kind of the new way of doing it, but if you submit a permit, you have to click the button to get the permit number. Back in 1995, when we first did that, it was just a counter. And still basically just a counter that would appear, those counters that appeared at the bottom of web pages back in the day when you thought, ooh, 17 people looked at our web page today. So we use that counter, and it just sequentially, every time you hit the page, it would go up one, so it would give you a unique number. And that little incredibly low-tech way of assigning permit numbers has survived since 1995. And every time we redo the pages, and what they're struggling with now is there's all sorts of security, and obviously we have low tolerance for insecure pages, as some of you found out on our link. And so we have to find again a counter that will deliver this very simple function and provide unique permit numbers. But it was a really cool thing, and I don't know why I told you that.
Your son.
Yes, son. It was something to do with the numbers. Oh, back in the days when 17 people, watching our, coming to our website was a big deal. So 17 people watching us online, I would consider going viral. So most of our meeting today is going to be focused on the draft regs that we are continuing to move along, and as are relatively on schedule for moving them through kind of the review process this fall, and expect to come out with a draft for public comment later this fall, early next year. Would that be fair to say? Yes. All schedule subject to modification. So we'll do that in a second. The routine updates that we have are relatively minimal this month. It's only been a month since we met last. Not a huge number of things. So one thing I do want to cover, because of the comments that we got, and obviously we're still struggling with some of or working out the kinks of the new website. But it will get there, and it will be really cool. But this is the MassDEP page. There are some things we're trying to work out the limitations in different page types, and all of which is far too much detail than you actually want or need to know. But there are reasons that we're still working out for things like you go here, and the obvious things, it's not really clear where you go for kind of waste site cleanup stuff. Although we did get the find out about contaminated property, which is the searchable sites list. Here, and it is a little bit easier, to choose between, the typical one and the one that just does EDEP, which is useful for very specific purposes. Oh, and Eileen is looking at that. This is a really cool one if you haven't done this one, because it was buried in the old version of the website, you can search for particular forms. So you can find all the REO forms that were submitted, within a date range, within a particular region, for instance. So you can do different kinds of searches through here. It's limited only to the EDEP sites, but since you have been submitting things this way since 2009, that universe is growing larger and larger. You can't get to the old scanned stuff this way, but for what it can be used for, it's really cool. And that's there.
How do you get directly to the forms?
How do you get directly to the forms? Okay, so there's that. And actually, before we get there, there's also the little videos that are now slightly out of date because it refers to the old website, but it talks about how to use the two searchable site stuff. And the things about understanding the search results gives you a detailed description of what all of the acronyms mean, which again was on the old site but kind of hard to find. So some of these things actually make it easier to use by being able to pull together in one place very useful information. The forms, so this is DEP's, I was going to say main page or home page, but in this structure there really isn't a home page. It's structured slightly differently. We didn't get a box there yet. Still working on that. But if you scroll down here, you'll find that Wayside Cleanup is a related organization. And I would recommend bookmarking this page for our work. This is the equivalent of our homepage. This may disappear sometime in the future. There are different ways that it may be structured, organized. All of that is kind of a work in progress, so have patience.
And you can't get back to the DEP, not the homepage, right?
They may be a related organization, yes.
Okay.
Yes. It's a two-way relationship.
So Paul, for those of us who can't see that far, what is that website? Mass.gov?
It's www.mass.gov
Yeah, that's good.
/ORGS.
Okay.
And then Bureau-of-Waste-Site-Cleanup-MassDEP.
Okay.
But if you go to mass.gov/DEP and then look down to the related organizations, you'll find it. That's the way I do it. And I even have it bookmarked. Or you can Google it. All of these pages, I mean, that's a good point because part of the design of these pages and how they're structured and set up and the stuff going behind the scenes is specifically designed to find this information through search and to work really well with search. And because that's the way most people do it anyway. So you can do that. I'm still working on answering a question. Yes, ma'am?
One point on Googling it, and I don't know if this is going to change, but right now if you Google like the advisory committee, you'll get two different websites.
Okay, right now, so the old website is still there. It's lingering, partly to ease the. It's partly to ease the transition. So, for instance, and the reason I say that, so we are working towards getting redirects. So as pages are created, you won't actually be able to get to the old one, even though they'll still exist. And so we're doing that. But the forms.
So can you get to this landing page from the main?
Not directly. You
have to go through related organizations.
Related organizations, or go to bookmark the Wayside Cleanup page.
Is that going to change?
All of this is going to change somehow. It's going to continue to be tweaked and improved. Part of what we are also working with is all of these pages are different kinds of templates for different sorts of pages. And not all the templates are done yet and provided to the state agencies to actually use. So, for instance, this page, for instance, is what's called a curated list, and this just became available to us recently to use. But as you see here, you can you have the transmittal forms. Click on there, or bring you down, and you can go from there to transmittal forms, and you'll actually get a page with the transmittal forms, and you can pick and choose which ones you want. Let's do 104. We'll bring you down to 104, and it tells you 34,233 permanent and temporary solutions have been filed through FY16. Cool. But it gives you a link to go to EDP or to download the 104. The old site is still there. This actually links to the document that sits on the old site. That will be moved over as well as we continue to migrate it over. So it's slowly working, and we are looking for comments and suggestions and pain points that you're finding.
Is that the number of actual permanent and temporary solutions filed, or is that the number of forms filed?
Well, first, keep in mind this is somewhat decorative.
That's not a count.
So, that is based on the statistics of permanent and temporary solutions filed for us. So it's data based off that we had a link, which you probably can't find now, but eventually we'll migrate over to this, of program statistics, including the different types of notifications and RIOs and things like that. It came from there.
So that's not going to update if someone submits?
No, that doesn't automatically update. Oh, that would be cool. We may get there eventually. But so it is improving. Again, any comments or thoughts or suggestions or things that you kind of, as we work through migrating stuff over, we're trying to get the things that are most commonly used and most important first. But if there's something that you need or think should be there or think it's more important and should be migrated over, let us know and we can do that. And the goal is to have most of this migrated over by the end of December, I think is the deadline for that. So, and we're working. Wayside Cleanup, I think, is slightly ahead of everybody else because one program is easier to deal with.
Are documents downloading faster? It seems to me that they are.
Are documents downloading faster? That I would like to claim credit, yes. No, it may be. We are always the documents. If the documents you're talking about are the PDFs, the site documents, hopefully they are. The IT staff actually has been very good about kind of reviewing things and tweaking and improving it. Kind of behind the scenes that sometimes we don't even know that they're doing things, and updating the servers, and eventually everything is, or many things are going to be moved to the cloud. So yes, there are, and that's aside from this. There's a lot of work going on with the iPass project. We talked about the data portal and all the stuff related to iPass. That's going on. That means bringing in new servers, improving connectivity. There's a project to fatten the pipes coming and going from this building and our regional buildings. So there are a lot of incremental changes that hopefully will add up to things like documents downloading faster. And I'm glad you're actually noticing. Okay, with that, any other comments or issues particularly from the advisory committee that you want to hear about either today or would like to put on the agenda or have us think about into the future before we get into the regs stuff? Silence, excellent. Everything is rosy. Yeah. Did you catch those facial expressions? No, so we'll move on to the talking about the regs that are upcoming. And
Good, right on time. Okay, thanks, Paul. So we're going to spend the rest of this time talking about the amendments that are being pulled together and kind of broken up the time into 3 segments. The first would be to review the things that we've talked about in committee meetings here and some additional meetings that we've held over the last year or so, those specific topics, and kind of bring you up to date on where we went with those discussions in terms of the proposals. And then the second thing would be to look at that spreadsheet. And I know some of you, including myself, weren't able to click on that link and get those documents. So if you were one of those people, we have copies outside of that spreadsheet. And go through that list. And if you want to flag anything on there for some additional discussion, if it hadn't already been covered in the first part of discussion, then we can spend some time on that. And then the last part, there are a few specific issues that really are, most of them are related to actually the kind of experience you're having, so I think we would benefit from getting some informal feedback on some of the questions that are there related to proposals that we have somewhat drafted in the package right now, but we want to finish up. So that would just help us to see whether we're considering all the relevant issues related to those things. Paul mentioned that we're pretty much on our latest schedule for doing this. Wayside cleanup staff and Office of General Counsel, the wayside cleanup attorneys, are reviewing the draft right now. Their comments, or they're supposed to complete that process by Halloween, and then next week, Wednesday, the wayside cleanup senior staff has our regularly scheduled monthly meeting, so we're going to be having some more discussion there. So the timing here is good because issues that you bring up today, we can bring those into that discussion next week, so that will be helpful. We've already briefed the Commissioner's Office. That's a step we take before we go up and brief EEA. The EEA briefing has been rescheduled, but we expect that to happen sometime soon. And then we'll be hopefully given the green light to go out and publish the draft, and we'll have to go through that 30-day process of providing public notice, scheduling the hearings, and meet those timelines there.
Liz, are you going to be providing a draft for review prior to public comment?
The question was, are we going to have a pre-public comment review draft? And no, we're not planning on doing that. We're hoping that we can get a lot of feedback in this discussion, but we'd like to move ahead in the interest of time and kind of minimizing the additional review loops, and just put that out and get our comments as part of the public hearing process.
So when you said public hearing draft this fall, so you expect it to be out this year?
We have already put together a public hearing draft, which is, you know, at the 90% complete level in terms of having everything in there. Our staff is reviewing that, and we'll be working on the wording of things, identifying, you know, whether we correctly cross-reference things, covered all the issues, and doing any additional changes based on what we hear in today's discussion. And then we'll have that draft. I think we will have it at the point where it's ready to be published. Whether we actually get into holding a hearing, it's unlikely, in fact, probably not even doable before the end of this year. But we would have that draft. I think once we get it okayed, we can actually even post it prior to the public hearing. So that's what we're working towards, having it available by the end of this year. Okay, so since we don't have a huge group, I'm less worried about time, but I'd like to kind of roughly divide the time we have now into thirds. Do this review of our past discussions, then spend a third of the time on going through the Excel spreadsheet of issues, and then the discussion issues at the end. So those of you who have been following along all this past year, you recall that we've had a couple of meetings related to possible changes related to imminent hazards. I'm going to let Paul go through that. Groundwater 1 related changes and providing some additional flexibility there in terms of things that would not be considered groundwater 1. Temporary solutions, we had that discussion back in June, and Nancy had a meeting about exposure point concentrations in soil. So I'm gonna kind of walk through those, and then also just show you some of the where we are on proposed standard changes. So Paul, you want to?
So some, if not all, no, not all of you, but many of you came to our discussion about imminent hazards last year. Boy, this has been going on for a while. Where we talked about potential changes. Let's see. This is just so. Imminent hazards is you're triggered by 2-hour notifications, and we have imminent hazard. Well, 2-hour notifications are triggered by imminent hazards or potential imminent hazards. Brian Rodden, who is staffing one of the cameras today, at one point at the advisory committee meeting, went over some of this data about kind of how many imminent hazards we have, 2-hour notifications, and how many end up having imminent hazard evaluations conducted that come into us. So when we started out this process, we thinking it was a kind of a bigger deal, a lot more imminent hazard evaluations going on than once we looked into the details. We found, and some of what we heard in the discussion meeting that we had, work group meeting, where we had floated the idea of possibly looking at the way that we evaluate cancer risk for imminent hazards and non-cancer risk for imminent hazards. And I think part of the conclusions that came out of that is that we were talking about a lot of kind of reworking of the regulations and the way that we do things and the process by which we evaluate things for a relatively small number of cases, and that it might not in fact be worth the kind of confusion and the effort given that the problems that we were trying to address actually were relatively minimal in terms of number and potentially could create more inconsistencies and issues than when we started. So we took part of that and went back, and Brian looked at the numbers to see kind of where we are looking at imminent hazards, kind of, and what triggers them. And for FY15, so just to summarize, we have 662 2-hour notifications, 201 72-hour, so about 800. Of the 600, of the 2-hour notifications, 624 are not related to imminent hazards. 38 pose or could pose. Some of those were due to exceeding LELs, so kind of obvious things. Some of them were presumed to be imminent hazards, and people moved on and addressed it as if it were an imminent hazard. There were 11 imminent hazard evaluations actually conducted, and of those, there were 2 that were existed. So the numbers, there are a lot of different circumstances, and any given number, of course, may vary by a little bit, but the overall message that we get from this is that the number of imminent hazard evaluations are relatively small, and some of the 2016 is very similar in that way. So the messages that we got coming out of the work groups was that rather than focus on the potential cancer risk and reworking that, it would be better to focus on the numbers at 40.0321 to clarify, particularly for soil and the metals in soil and the PCBs in soil, when you trigger conditions that could pose an imminent hazard, and update and fine-tune those, as well as our staff had commented on making other wording changes that would clarify and provide certainty in doing those imminent hazard evaluations rather than rethinking the whole thing. So a long answer to say that the concept that I was proposing and pushing before of reworking the cancer risk evaluations for imminent hazards, we're going to pass on this time and focus more on clarifications, particularly on 0321, which I think may be included in the standard changes, the number changes.
I don't have those here.
But they will,
Yes,
yeah. But they are. That is being done. One thing that had been proposed and we're not in a position to, or not doing it at the time, was in that we might want to think about moving into the future, but not in this time frame, is looking at imminent hazard numbers like the soil numbers for 0321 for other types of media, to be very explicit about those. One of the wording changes that is coming out for imminent hazards that we're proposing and would like to comment on is just modifying and flipping the language that it says an imminent hazard, you have an imminent hazard if the exposure and the risk exceeds 1 in 100,000 for the short-term exposure, or has an index of 1 for the non-cancer risk. We're proposing, based upon kind of long-term discussions that we've had internally and with you guys, about the effects of rounding and the uncertainty that creates, and questions about whether something like a hazard index of 1.4 does or does not pose an imminent hazard. We're proposing to flip that language to say that an imminent hazard exists if, for example, the hazard index is equal to or greater than the hazard index of 1, or equal to or greater than a cancer risk of 1 in 100,000 for that short-term exposure. So that's based on this, to clarify that if you have for example, the hazard index of 1.4, we would avoid the situation of if you go with the 2 significant figures or 2 values. I know, like, I really want to do this.
Isn't that going back to significant? Isn't that just what you're just basically trying to do is a runaround of significant figures?
Well, what we try to do is make it very clear when somebody has a regulatory imminent hazard that needs to be addressed, and avoid the situation where the calculations introduce uncertainty by both for the regulated community and DEP staff and the community that may be exposed, where you have a calculation that appears to indicate that that it poses an imminent hazard, but there's a justification proposed by rounding that it, in fact, by regulation, isn't. This would clarify that and make it clear, when an imminent hazard would be determined to exist.
If you have one significant figure, then 1.3 is what? Are you going to say greater than 1.0? Are you going to go to a second significant figure?
We're not proposing to change any of the guidance that we have for rounding at all, or the significant figures. So, which very clearly states right at the beginning that the LSPs have an option of either using the absolute method, which means if you calculate it out to 2 significant figures, you can use 2 significant figures, or use rounding.
So it doesn't sound like the proposed language is going to address it, because if you're still allowing rounding, people will get to 1, which won't address the issue you're trying to resolve.
Well, it does. The combination of the uncertain, so the rounding introduces the concept of this uncertainty in what that number is. This change will switch that balance for a small number of sites where it does come up. And as we talked about, the imminent hazard evaluations where this comes up is relatively small number, but it avoids the uncertainty of having calculated versions where we're now in the position of explaining that, well, yes, it calculated out as 1.3, but that's not a real number. There's variability around that. There's uncertainty around that. that 1.3 is no different from 1. That 1.3 is no different from 0.8. So because there's uncertainty around it, we're going to assume we're going to round down to one significant figure and assume that it's not an imminent hazard. It is equally legitimate and appropriate to say there's uncertainty around that number. It might be 1.3, it might be 0.8, but the difference is that in one case, you take action to reduce exposure that might be an imminent hazard within that uncertainty, rather than saying, well, it might be an imminent hazard, but we're not going to address it in the short term. We'll deal with it later.
So the language does address it because it's now equal to or greater than.
Right.
So even if you round to 1, that puts you in. Whereas before, if it was just greater than and you're rounding, then the equal to 1 gets you out. So the language does address
Right.
it.
And we're doing this for imminent hazards because of the need to make decisions in a short period of time, and because of the short-term nature of the problems that we're dealing with. And it becomes a question of, particularly for things like developmental toxins, of it's an imminent hazard, we need to address it in the short term, versus it still may pose a risk. We'll get to it in 3 years. We'll get to it in 5 years. And the difference is, if in fact, because of that uncertainty, it was an imminent hazard, you've now allowed 3 years of exposure while it's being studied.
Okay, so if I understand, one of the reasons you actually started to revisit this whole idea of imminent hazards was the question about, is 5 years even the appropriate? Good. Okay. Is 5 years the appropriate window to be looking at an imminent hazard, and is that really imminent? And then the presentation you just made said, you know, it doesn't happen all that often, so we're not going to reevaluate the 5-year window because it's just too small a universe, and so it's not a good use of our resources. Or and I don't mean resources, I meant resources in general, not just GDP's resources, in terms of how we expend our efforts on the MCP. So, but now you've kind of said, okay, but when you calculate the imminent hazard, you now, where, you know, you could maybe have tempered some of that 5-year window because we were using one significant figure of 1. Now it's the, you know, 1 or greater. So shouldn't you maybe rethink about if 5 is the right number, since you're now broadening what's going to be falling into that universe?
Can you go back to your chart? Like, are there literally any sites that this is relevant to?
Well,
they're way easier around.
Well,
the cancer risk.
I can't. It's not easier to go back to that slide, so I won't. And in the numbers themselves, as I said, you know, take with a grain of salt. It's really order of magnitude because.
My point is that for the duration, it only is relevant to the cancer risk, and there literally may be 0 sites that this is actually an issue.
Yeah. That was part of it. That was part of the discussion at the work group meeting. That there are kind of slightly different issues, but I take the point that particularly for the carcinogens, that if there's a question about whether the 5-year exposure is appropriate, then within that kind of realm of uncertainty and kind of assumed exposure duration, that may be an issue. So we'll take that point and we can discuss kind of potential alternatives to that even before the regs go out, and then certainly, you know, as part of the public comment. I think where it has come in more, it is more significant, I hate using that word, is more significant for the non-cancer risk, where it is a short period of time that's concerned, and that has been the focus of that. So to the extent, so we'll take a look at that, particularly as it concerns the cancer risk, and balance it with the number of these evaluations that are being driven by cancer risk now are relatively low, but still for those, and I say that keeping in mind that for those sites that are in this area where the imminent hazard evaluation is being evaluated, you know, it's important whether it's one site, you know, it's that site, it's the people that are being exposed at that site. So I don't want the overall numbers to minimize the effects that might have the implication for one site. but particularly for the non-cancer risk and the developmental effects that are short-term exposures, this is a big issue and is significant not in terms of numbers, but for the exposures that are occurring at that site. And that binary world of it either is an imminent hazard or not an imminent hazard, and if it is, you have to do something, and if it isn't, you have a longer period of time to evaluate and address it. That becomes more of an issue. And as a regulatory agency, being in a position, and I would assume from a risk communication point of view for you guys as well, explaining that, well, there's uncertainty in these numbers, and this 1.4, could really be 0.8. It never works the other way, that you calculate 0.8. I've never heard anybody say that, it could really be 1.4, so we're going to do something anyway. So I think there is a obligation or obligation on us as a regulatory agency where there is some bias in this, and whether you say greater than or equal to or greater than introduces a bias of kind of how you're interpreting this. We are choosing to bias this in the side of, if there's uncertainty in these numbers, and we don't deny that if you don't know, if you don't have enough confidence and precision in those numbers, and it could pose an imminent hazard, then we should be evaluating it as an imminent hazard. We shouldn't simply be rounding it down, because that is a policy decision, whether it's equal to or greater than.
I think from the perspective of people who are studying these chemicals, short-term exposures to, for example, fetal exposures in utero, kids, the short term really matters. And the short term, I don't think we're discussing the averaging time per se for the non-cancer, right? And so the data support, the academic, scientific data on outcomes support the need for using this shorter window, because those are what's going to continue to come up in terms of imminent hazards. And so I think moving away from deciding what's the right averaging time, how do we go back and look at our points of departure for cancer risk, I think that's problematic, right? But I think by focusing on those imminent hazards that are likely coming down the pike, that the short window with the question of, should we be worried about this, should we do something now, is the right question to be asking, and I think that this change supports that. And that's it.
One other thing to note in this is that we're not proposing changing the way it's evaluated for the long-term risk. Not that that's at the end of the process where we feel the site has been adequately characterized. We know what's going on. It's really a question of the long-term exposures and the long-term risk, but that this is more unique, both for the short-term exposures and the short-term, the short period of time we have to make decisions about what needs or not needs to be done.
I did have one question. You had on the list a bunch of imminent hazard assumed. What fell into that category?
Okay, I'll go back to that one. Maybe I should make Brian come up and talk about it. These are his slides. I know, it was a while ago. I know, I'm going to go here.
In the left there.
Often when we have a 2-hour notification for a potential imminent hazard, it may be, and you guys can speak to this as well as I can, you have more direct field experience, that if there's a potential imminent hazard, there's notification for a possible potential imminent hazards, there are choices. One, you could just move ahead as if it were an imminent hazard and take those short-term measures, conduct an immediate response action. So that, I think that's what gets at the, let's just assume it's an imminent hazard. And
those are spills.
well, it may, no, I think a lot of the spills are in the, in this.
What these likely are, so there are concentration limits in the MCP that require a notification. If you have a potential imminent hazard, you then have an option to say,
I understand that.
yeah, to say, I'm going to do an imminent hazard evaluation.
I totally understand that. So
Yeah. So I think that's
whether this was what it was for.
Yeah, so the assumed, I think, are those ones where you don't actually do the imminent hazard evaluation to try and disprove it.
yeah. You could,
You could,
but it may be if the level is potential imminent hazards 10 and you're seeing 100, then.
No, they're metal concentrations. Like if you're within a certain distance of a residence or school and you have arsenic in it.
Yes, and exactly, that's what I was, if you have it off the top of your head, for those situations where you assume, because you met some threshold, right? What was the, what was the hazard?
So, okay, so they're different.
I'm not asking the right question. It's okay.
I think it's what Juliana is talking about.
I think it's a mix, and I think Brian actually had to go dig into the reports to determine this. Let's ask Brian.
Yeah, I think it can be a mix of different things. One is you're above a soil concentration, that threshold, the published concentration, and maybe it's more cost effective. It's a very small area. Maybe it's more cost effective to go excavate that soil as opposed to conducting the imminent hazard evaluation. You know you're gonna have to do it anyways. Or the other universe of that was probably TCE vapor intrusion sites where, again, you know there's risk. You know you're gonna have to put an SSD in eventually because you can see that out into the future. So at that time, you go ahead and do it, or you're bringing air purifying units in, and you don't conduct the evaluation per se. It's more of a very qualitative evaluation and a risk management decision.
Thanks, Brian. So we're going to continue on with just kind of summarizing the bigger discussions we had. The next set of things we talked about in a separate meeting were proposals related to GW1 areas. What's in the draft now are the following. One is, we talked about this, petroleum in Zone 2's, that provision that we have now that says if you're within a Zone 2, so it's an existing well, you're within the Zone 2 of that, or an adjoining aquifer protection district, and you have petroleum contamination and you can show that it won't reach the wellhead, that you could support a permanent solution for that condition. And the way that was worded, it currently is says where the contamination is limited to oil. That raised questions about, well, what if I have other constituents, but they're at the drinking water standards? Shouldn't that be allowed? And when we've had that question in the past, we've said, no, that's not how the reg is worded. So the change is going to do two things. It's, instead of using contamination is limited to oil, it's going to use petroleum hydrocarbons. We're not proposing to go in and change the oil definition. So we're proposing that will stay as is. But it will be written in a way that if you have other constituents that are meeting the drinking water standards, that this could apply. The non-potential drinking water source area discussion, that's where you have a potential drinking water source area, but if you have so this is future areas that are reserved for future development of municipal water supplies, public water supplies, and certain land uses over those can, if they meet certain criteria, area criteria, they can drop out as non-potential drinking water source areas. And LSPs do that evaluation. We have guidance on that. We were asked to look at a number of different things there in terms of making that more flexible. I think in the end, this is a relatively modest proposal. We looked at all of the suggestions, and this is the one we felt that was clear and we could support. Other ones were let the land uses change over time, so don't fix it in time back to a certain period of time. I think it's 1996. We did not think that was consistent with the intent of reserving these areas, that we did not want more areas to drop out as potential water supply resource areas as more development occurred over time. Another one was to look at residential housing of, right now it's limited, I think, to a 1/4 acre, so to look at bigger acre sizes. We also did not want to incorporate that into these changes for different reasons, and I think we at one point considered possibly 1/3 of an acre. The resources involved in kind of finding those areas and mapping those areas are pretty large, and it actually would only address a small number of areas in the state. So I think that one we kind of tabled as more of a resource issue. Matt?
So do we correctly understand that what we're saying is landfills and wastewater residual monofills added as of January 1st, 1997?
Yes, right. We're not going to change the date, but we are going to include these additional land uses. And where we went for these land uses that would be considered appropriate is we went to the rules for citing drinking water wells and defining the Zone 1 and Zone 2 areas and what can be placed in those areas as a list of what would be appropriate. And this was one that was not part of our non-potential drinking water source areas. The last one I think may address a few more sites. There are surface water reservoirs around the state that are not actively used, but they're held as emergency supplies. And strictly speaking, these do have Zone A's around them. But water supply separately does not protect them for water supply purposes as Zone A's, and GIS does not have them appear on maps as map Zone A's. So they've made a decision that, for the purposes of protecting them, they're not given the same protection as Zone A's. So this change would make our regs equivalent to that, and we would not include those as GW1 areas.
Liz?
Yeah.
On the petroleum one?
Yes.
Now if you can have petroleum higher than, or oils, or say, higher than the drinking water standard at the source area as long as the downgradient well does not detect. Is that going to be the same here, or do the non-petroleum constituents have to be below drinking water standards in the source area?
In the source area. So it's not the same attenuation happening. It's that where they otherwise are meeting the drinking water standards, which seems like obviously, but that's not how it was written. So the way it's currently written is the contamination you have is just oil.
So for example, Larry, one of the sites I have, so petroleum all meets, you have the petroleum, 1,000 feet, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But there was 6 parts per billion of MTBE in the bedrock, and right now it says no, et cetera. But 6 parts per billion MTBE would be below the standards and not an issue. So under the old rules, not allowed, but under this change, maybe the site will close.
Yeah, but on the other hand, if you had leaded gas and you have lead above the drinking water standard at the source area, but at your well,
it's not going to help.
500 feet away, you have nothing. You're still stuck.
I mean, does it really help with MTBE? I don't think so.
Yeah.
It helps with petroleum. MTBE is not petroleum.
That's correct. But non-petroleum contaminants such as MTBE that are present in groundwater that meet the drinking water standards already everywhere will now be okay.
Yeah, petroleum
Whereas
hydrocarbons.
before,
No,
even though they met drinking water standards,
And that case was a specific example and specific comments that we have received.
Right.
That even if you had low levels of other contaminants, whether it's lead or MTBE or something else, that the mere presence of those contaminants ruled out the flexibility in this provision.
So
even though they
does work.
presented no risk.
It does work for leaded gasoline as well. It would work for lead as well.
But you have to meet the drinking water standard even at the source area, although you don't. Yes.
Yeah.
That's what Liz is saying.
That is correct.
So you'd have to meet the drinking water standard in the source area, even though you're at your sentinel well, whatever you call it, there's nothing to test it.
Correct.
Right? So
Yeah, that's right.
As long as the only thing that you kind of get a pass on for exceeding standards in the source area, in a GW1 area that's protected for current and future drinking water use, are the petroleum hydrocarbons that are presumed not only to dilute and attenuate, but to biodegrade as well. So things, particularly things like lead, if you have lead concentrations exceeding the drinking water standards or the GW1 standards in a GW1 area, that needs to be addressed first.
Elliot?
In the non-potential drinking water source area, will there be definition as to what constitutes a wastewater residual landfill?
Yes, there are references there. I'm not exactly sure myself, and I'm doing some follow-up on that. Yeah, they're specifically, we took the exact reference that is in the drinking water regulations, but it's not something I recognize, so we were going to look into that, make sure that's clear, and mapped. That there is hopefully a specific data layer that's clear that's attached to that too as well, so it will appear on the maps. This is advancing. So temporary solutions, we talked about this in June. And at that time, we reviewed, again, we looked at data related to temporary solutions and filings related to temporary solutions. And this is, I think this kind of represents, and is related to when we made the changes back in 2014 to move from response action outcomes, where it was less clear the difference to, at least to the layperson, what the difference between an RAO A and B and C were, to calling things permanent and temporary solutions. We kind of recognize that temporary solutions had there's the potential there for people to misinterpret that when they have a site with a temporary solution, that they've pretty much reached an endpoint of a kind. And I think what we've been trying to do with changes is to reinforce that temporary solutions is a milestone, but it's not an endpoint. And in many cases, particularly temporary solutions where something is feasible, they just didn't happen to get there by the time that they had to reach a temporary solution or a permanent or temporary solution. The work's still ongoing. That's no different from any other site that's proceeding through the response action process. But there was a lot of lack of clarity on those sites, whether or not they had to keep the tier classification valid, whether they needed to be filing in certain cases status reports and remedial monitoring reports. So what we're proposing to clarify in some cases and in other cases put in a new requirement are the following. One is to require that for all of these sites, they keep the tier classification valid. So that's no longer a question about, well, if I'm doing this, do I need a valid one, and can I let it expire in this case? We're really going to look at these sites as they are having ongoing steps that they need to take to get to a permanent solution. We're going to simplify the tier classification extension process for all sites. So for temporary solution sites and other sites, that you will no longer have that. You must file it 45 days before it expires. It's just going to be effective on the date that you submit it. We're going to make it clearer that if active operation and maintenance is occurring as part of this temporary solution, that it would require 6 months status reports and remedial monitoring reports. And then the new thing here is that we're going to establish where they're not otherwise giving us a status report. So these would be the sites that aren't doing active O&M, that we want some type of report coming in on a frequent basis. And we're describing it as an annual report unless some other schedule is approved. And that schedule could be, really not much is going to happen here. It really isn't feasible to do much of anything at this point in time. We're proposing that you're not going to hear from us again for another 5 years. So it could be all the way up to what we have currently now is that 5-year periodic review is what's necessary. But the starting assumption is that it will be an annual report unless otherwise approved. So that's a proposal we have in the draft. We know there'll probably be a lot of comments on that, but we wanted to put something down for people to respond to in the public comment. Given our intention of trying to get these sites back on track and to know the status of what's going on at these sites.
Would there be actual DEP approval of that?
Well, so the approval, yes. Now, so here's the thing with the approval, and I don't know if we're all comfortable with this as well, but one of the things is we could make it a presumptive approval. The one thing is when we look across the different regions and how many temporary solution sites there are in the different region, there's a potential that if we said it's presumed to be annual, or it's presumed that we're okay with your proposed schedule unless you hear from us in 21 days, we're not sure we can handle that initial glut of proposals. So that's what we're concerned about. We're not sure we want to commit to the 21-day or some type of presumptive review time frame. It's more of a resource issue. So that's why it's written this way, to solicit other ideas. I think we want to start with the most controlled proposal from our perspective, and then we would figure that other good ideas might come in on how to handle that.
Ideas not only on the time frame that 2 years is better than 1 year, but really how to kind of manage the approval process, whether there's any differences in the type of sites, or what factors might go into extending that time period. The whole package of it's up for comments. And the more detail and the more thought, suggestions that go into it, the easier it will be for us to kind of evaluate it.
Right, and I mentioned that we're sitting down next week with our senior staff. They also want to weigh in on this as well. They're still kind of mulling this over. So it's not fully formed yet, but as of now, that is how it's in the draft. Yes.
Quick question. I suspect if it goes out like this, after public comment, there'd be a lot of questions on, as well as like the annual requirement, or the up to the LSP of evaluating that. But the CP putting out guidance at some point. This type of site, we want to see annual. This type of site could qualify for every 5 years. Something like this.
Well, so the question was, what kind of guidance is there on in terms of some alternative schedule? And right now we have least criteria to consider. So we have one line in there, you know, alternative schedules can be proposed based on, and then we kind of list some things to consider. So potentially, but I think it's probably something we want to give discretion. You know, tell us why. Tell us why this really isn't something you need to hear about. And I think we also want to make form changes if possible. That's a kind of a difficult thing, more difficult thing sometime than reg changes. But that it get indicated on the form, so we know, we don't have to go dig through the report, oh, what's the frequency going to be? We know, and we can kind of set that up in our database so it's all tracked much more easily and easier to find. I think one of the interesting things too in looking at the more recent temporary solution submittals is twice as many of them are something is feasible. So the ones that have come in since the reg changes, 2 to 1, they're the type that says something is feasible. We just didn't get there in 6 years. So I think that's another kind of something to consider, that these sites are really still doing work, and they should be kind of managed the same way other sites doing work are. The other thing related to this is those provisions in 40.1067, work after a permanent or temporary solution, remedial actions after a permanent or temporary solution. We're proposing to take the temporary solutions out of there. So that section is just related to work after a permanent solution. And then because this is one of the things that led to the lack of clarity in the regulations, is that what you do at a temporary solution site was kind of addressed in 3 different places, and now we're going to pull that into just that post-temporary solution section that's in the 800. Exposure.
So is that going to be parallel to what's on a permanent solution? You know, I mean, I know one of the points that was coming up about the question of, you know, can you do post-permanent solution, URAMs rather than. So you've got the same circumstance on a temporary solution. You know, you may even be working on something that's feasible, but then there's some type of, utility work or construction work.
Yeah.
That isn't necessarily wrapped to what your remedy is. So it just.
Right, and I think it would be treated just like if it was a site in phase 4. Or any other site that's still inside the permanent solution line. You can do URAMs at those sites, you can do RAMs at those sites. We don't need to specify or put that in a separate section, because you're really just proceeding with pre-permanent solution response actions. Exposure point concentrations in soil. Nancy Bettinger held a meeting to discuss this proposal for updating the approach for determining soil EPCs at complex sites where you can expect higher variability in terms of the contaminant concentrations. And the proposal, there was a lot of discussion there about how do you identify these sites, which sites would DEP be expecting that use the 95% upper confidence limit on the mean for establishing exposure point concentrations. So the draft tries to provide more detail or examples of which sites we wouldn't expect this and which sites we would. So kind of defining both ends of it. And also leaving some discretion, leaving discretion as to when you fall into these categories. What else did I want to mention? Oh, the exposure point concentration section in general, it's been so it will look like there are a lot of changes, but really things have been worked around to go through establishing exposure point concentration by media. So now it's broken out more clearly, and it takes each medium in turn to kind of say what's the appropriate way to establish exposure point concentrations. We did get comments after the meeting Nancy held from the LSP Association, wanted to make sure that we were looking at this issue holistically and as it relates to other issues like screening, identifying contaminants of concern, sampling, and we do anticipate that people will want to talk about this more. So what we're proposing to do is that once the draft is out, we will hold an additional session or two to talk about the language and bring in all those other issues.
You're still considering a sampling guidance, or that was on the table for a while?
Yeah, the sampling guidance is still in the works, right, Nancy? Yeah. ISM, yep. ISM is actually referenced in these provisions, so yeah, look for that as well. So I just want to, let me see if I'm sticking to this, dividing up the time. Okay, so I just wanted to go through the summary of the standard changes, just like summary statistics. So did you realize we have 1,440 standards total, groundwater, Method 1 groundwater and soil standards? There are changes proposed to 18% of these. The majority of those changes are the standards going up, 87% of those going up. There's the breakdown there. And and a lot of these changes are relatively minor changes based on updated exposure factors using EPA's exposure factors. We also have, as you know, we're going to establish new standards for 5 PFAS-related compounds for both soil and groundwater, and reportable concentrations based on that. Other standards to note, the PCE GW2 standard will be proposed to be changing from 50 to 20 micrograms per liter, and that's a holdover from the last reg package, the 2014 change. If you recall, that toxicity value was under review. This is a MassDEP toxicity value was under review, and so it wasn't included in the 2014 amendments. Several PAHs are increasing because of a decrease in the benzoate pyrene toxicity value. Cadmium, the GW3, is going from 4 to 8 micrograms per liter based on new ecological toxicity values. And the vinyl chloride S1 standard is going down based on mutagen risk, and included in the looking at EPA values included consideration of age-dependent risk for mutagens in early life. So this change was based on the effect of that, incorporating that factor. Oh,
Can I ask a couple questions?
Juliana?
Yeah. I don't, maybe you said it already. Do we have a sense of timing on implementation of this proposed standard? Just you're going to see those PCE sites close, and just wondering what the timing is.
Yeah. So every time we do a reg package and we have standard changes, we do try to give a window where you could use both sets of standards, and so I anticipate we'll do the same sort of thing. So if we have a public hearing draft, best case on the street in January, then it will be okay. I'm doing this off the top of my head, so Paul, if this sounds unreasonable, but then it's always a couple of months. You know, hold the hearing, we get the comments back. We usually most of the time is usually spent digesting those comments and making changes to the draft. So best case, I would say we'd be finalizing something in the spring. Does that sound reasonable to you?
So it would probably have an effective date, hypothetically, and don't write this date down, but hypothetically in April 30th or something
Yeah.
like that. But we would put out, publish, make available, the final regs, and at some point before the effective date. So there would be a window where you can plan for closing sites, whether you're trying to close a site before the regs go into effect, or you want to make use of some of the new values like the pH values type of thing.
Going
You can do that in the interim.
Sure. Yeah, and you can do that with the method 2 right now, if
Right.
you wanted to, yeah. And then, thank you, that's helpful. And then on the vinyl chloride, is there going to be guidance about, under method 3, do you want people to be evaluating mutagenic potential of vinyl chloride in accordance with EPA guidance? But right now the state doesn't have guidance on that. So it's not incorporated into the...
Nancy, do you want to answer that question?
The question was just about the vinyl chloride change. Is you're including the mutagenic effect in the development of the RC. Is the intent that people would be following EPA's guidance on evaluating mutagenic effects under method 3? Right now there isn't state guidance on.
Would they be doing it now?
That
Yes,
process.
I would think so, yes, yes.
So, and will there be guidance
Do you
on
mean
that?
right now, before this is done?
Either way. Because right now, like if you follow the state's risk assessment guidance, you would not evaluate mutagenic effects for vinyl chloride.
Right, right. We usually set revisions of the short forms, the method 3 short forms, and changes in the method 3 short forms as a marker for when we expect people to do things. So until we change the short forms, we wouldn't necessarily, I mean, just in anticipation of future requirements, you might want to do that anyway, but we wouldn't, say, comment on a risk assessment that didn't do that until well after we changed the short form.
Yeah, so I guess I'm just trying to understand like how it will be communicated that this is expected and when that change will be made. Because this, obviously, this guidance on evaluating mutagenic effects from EPA has been around for a while. So just wanting to be clear with people about how they're supposed to understand that they're supposed to do it in Massachusetts. I get that it'll be in the RC, but if you're doing a site-specific risk assessment, where in guidance will people know that? And how will be clear about when that change was supposed to be made? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, going forward into the future, it will be in revised guidance. And we're revising human health and ecological risk assessment guidance, so it will be in that. But I would say that when it shows up in the short forms, then people should know for sure that that's when they should.
Yeah,
they're
so
expected to start doing it.
Yeah, so if the guidance is updated, that will be clear. Just a comment on the short forms, especially for people that are not like in this room or that don't practice in Massachusetts a lot, that can be a difficult way to interpret intent from the department.
Well, I mean, it could be a letter to the LSPA.
Yeah,
it can be. It'll be announced when we're changing and we expect people to do it. I mean, I think one difficulty is that those calculations are not. I don't consider them very straightforward.
They are not straightforward, right? It's not a simple
and
change
so,
to the short
so I would not be prepared right now to say, yeah, go ahead and do that, because I think we would be getting all kinds of different results back from that. So it needs to be a more formal start point accompanied by some written guidance as to how to do those calculations if you're doing them separately from the short form.
Yeah, it's just, I just see this as being vulnerable to all sorts of confusion
Right.
and different things happening in different
Right.
places.
And Nancy, would it be fair to say that we would probably be interested in doing training on that at the same time?
Yes, so what I got from Juliana's question is that we should do some kind of communication when that's incorporated into the short form. Okay, so are we ready to move on to the list of issues? Are there any town meeting people that go to town meeting in the room? Okay. I went to town meeting on Monday. I thought maybe we could do this similar to town meeting because we have 11 pages here. And in my small town, when we go through the budget, you get to put a hold on an item and then we can come back to it. That just might be a good way of seeing how many things people want to talk about. That doesn't mean if you don't hold an item, we can't go back to it, but maybe by page. So, is there anything anyone really wants to talk about on page 1? Oh, you don't have one, Elliot? Okay, all right, so maybe this won't work. How many people feel like they've gone through this list and they know? Nobody? Oh. You're the usual town meeting members. Okay, so
We're stapling them. There are. If you need more.
Well, so here's what I'll do. I'm going to. A lot of them are not much of anything. So I'm just gonna like read a short, abbreviated version of what the change is, and you tell me if you want to talk about it. Revised definition to distinguish exposure point pathway elimination measures and active remedial systems. Amendment would exclude Zone A's around emergency supplies. We talked about that. Changes to the historic fill definition. You'd like to talk about that?
Yeah, I just want to clarify for coal ash being considered anthropogenic background.
Yeah.
That wouldn't apply at a site where that was the main contaminant concern. Is that right? Or is it? Are you just talking about sites that are being investigated for other types of issues?
I think what this issue is the way it is now written is that the coal ash and wood ash is nested under the requirement that this be primarily soil. And so for sites where you have historic fill and then you have this layer of coal and wood ash, that created problems. So it just says with respect to coal and wood ash, it does not have to be primarily soil. So it's to make it more flexible. That's what that changes. Yeah. Yeah. What do I mean by old deposits? That's what I was just describing. Oh, well, it has to meet the age. It still has to meet the, was in place prior to date. Yeah.
In the historic fill definition, the thing I always get stuck on is proving it was there before it was brought to the site. So you've got an old 1800 era site with coal ash and wood ash and bricks and all the other stuff you see in the back bay. How do you prove it wasn't related? And there have been several generations of buildings on the site. How do you prove it wasn't related to site activities and it was there before it was brought to the site? I mean, it seems like that's almost an impossible bar to prove in any case.
How does that read now? I'm not. Paul, how does that read now when proving that it was there? It's this is one of those preponderance of the evidence thing.
I think it says something to the effect that can't be related to site activities and had to be deposited before it was brought to the site, something like that. The building was demolished and you got fragments of the brick and whatever. It almost excludes most of the site.
This sounds more like something you would address with guidance on it than with a reg wording, do you think? I don't have the answer to your question. but I'm not sure it would get reflected in the definition of historic fill.
Unless it was taken out.
Right, so there's a statement that the fill has to have been in place before January 1st, 1984.
So that's easy.
Yeah. All right, that's how it is.
That's not the what is that? That's not what you're talking about.
You have the definition?
Yeah.
metals hydrocarbon in the pH prior to emplacement.
Just the release, yeah.
So prior to emplacement.
Or the flip side of that is to show it's not related to a subsequent release.
I think it could be that, yeah, with like a history.
Yeah.
Activities, right, but there weren't activities on the property.
So maybe the policy will help clarify.
I don't know if there's a discussion of that in the draft guidance, but that seems like a guidance issue. But the intent of that is that it's not related to a release. You're not going to, it's not associated with a release that occurred on top of what was there. So now that you've had a chance to scan page 1, or can we move on? And I mean, this isn't your last opportunity. If you want to send me comments after this meeting. Page 2, we have the remedial additives. We're making that change to make it more narrowly written that it applies the concern when additives are being applied near a building. Oh, Eileen, yeah.
So,
You pass the mic, Liz?
for needing to put in additives, and maybe this is the right place, about the question about, you know, if you're doing like in situ stabilization,
Yeah.
whether that.
This was intended to.
That addresses
address
that.
that, yes.
Okay.
So,
So one of the issues had been with that 2014 change that said when you're doing additives near a school, daycare, residence, that you have to have a plan for that, and there's a presumptive approval of that plan. And the comment came up shortly after those regs went into effect. Well, what if I'm just stabilizing contaminated soil? That's not related to your concern, which is creating a potential vapor intrusion condition. So it's more narrowly written now, just to be focused on VOCs. Does anyone have suggestions of a better way to do this? No? Okay. All right, so page 2, we just talked about the remedial additives. And all this table now folds the minor things in with the bigger things, so they're all together. Add passive venting to the exceptions for point source emission treatment. Add new adequately regulated provisions for DPH overseeing cleanups of radioactive hazardous material releases. That's the bottom of page 2. I kind of skipping over things that are clarifications. There's a lot more. The changes have been made related to notices of activity and use limitations and surplus sites. You'll recall with the 2014 changes, we made a change, so now add surplus sites, notices of activity and use limitations may be used instead of grants, which had been used in the past. And we kind of had those provisions in 2 places. We had them up in the adequately regulated, and we had some exceptions or what was specific to those notices of AULs in the AUL section. And a lot of this change is to move most of that back up into the adequately regulated section in terms of saying with incorporating equivalency to remedy operation status is considered helpful in making those changes. So we're taking a stab at that language to kind of address the overlap of our two sets of regulations. What else on this page? Yes, Matt?
I don't know if there's any chance of the 100 parts per million as benzene being fixed or something, because everybody's, it always becomes an issue on the trigger for USTs, the 100 parts per million headspace as benzene.
What part of that would you like fixed?
Well, no, just because, I mean, people are always calibrating on isobutylene, so you have to keep reminding them to use the benzene conversion factor, so it's really going to be 200 parts per million on your meter, but that's really going to be 100 parts per million as benzene, but you're always using isobutylene. Everything else in the MCP is looking at it as isobutylene. So it's a confusion factor. It's been there for 20 years.
So the change would be to reference it to isobutylene.
Again, people could
or
complain,
we could have both.
Because right now you would be able to have 200 parts per million as isobutylene because the response factor is 0.5, and so they would say if you change it to 100 parts per million of isobutylene, others would be concerned that you'd be reducing a standard by 50%.
Well, you could have it be the lower of the two, or if you had both numbers, yeah. Okay.
I'm just saying it's something that trips up, because field people are usually the newer people, and it just trips up people every time.
Yeah, I don't see why we couldn't put that in there. Okay. Page 3. Going on. I think a lot of these are. Oh, Paul, do you want to explain the exemption for soils going to that being treated, recycled, reused? This is 317.13a.
317.13a, page 4 for those of you following along at home, and hopefully you can download that now. 317.13a. Oh yeah. This is an easy, simple one. In COM 15, in the approvals that we've been giving for the reclamation soil projects, and we have a number of them, and hopefully giving certainty for management of soil, we very explicitly have notification. There's a notification exemption that already exists for materials that are associated with permitted or licensed facilities. We're just being very specific about this to make sure that we include those facilities that are permitted using the ACOs under COM 15. To be clear that if you do all you due diligence and appropriately bring soil to these facilities, and somebody at some point goes and takes a sample, and at those locations, soil being what it is, at some point somebody might take a sample and find something above a reportable concentration there. That in and of itself does not trigger notification, and it gives the protections to the facility owners and operators and the people sending the soil there that if there's a spurious exceedance of an RC, that's not going to trigger notification because they have this explicit notification exemption. So it's just trying to be more obvious and more explicit about what had been using existing broader exemption before.
So in the interest of time and moving to the discussion questions, I'm just kind of scanning things that I think you'd be more interested in. So the top of page 6, conceptual site model. In 2014 is when we put a definition of conceptual site model into the regulations, and we specifically asked for the conceptual site model to be described in phases 1 and 2, and then part of the permanent solution. And I think at that time we were saying we're going to be limited in terms of how many times we ask you to document this. I think now we really think, because 1, it's a good idea. 2, most people are doing it anyway. And 3, it really facilitates our review when we pick up other response action documents like the phase 3, that we would like to see a restatement of the conceptual site model in that document if nothing's changed, or have it be updated as part of that document. So we have added that language throughout the different provisions of the regs. I know there's an argument that that's just additional documentation, but we think this is reasonable and useful documentation to ask for. The item right under that, temporary solution feasibility evaluation of alternatives, where we're stating that we want to see more than an all or none evaluation of temporary solution alternatives, which sometimes we get. We could do the very expensive full cleanup or not. We can't pay for that, and so we want consideration to be given to partial cleanups. Remedy operation status. I talked about the changes to temporary solution. We covered that. We tried to clarify gardening and what is a qualitative evaluation of exposures from gardening in the risk characterization section. Talked about standard changes. We talked about the oil exemption. I'm now on the top of page 7. Exposure point concentrations, imminent hazards. Paul talked about the imminent hazard evaluation and the inserting the equal to or language. Oh, okay, so this would be of note, but on the bottom of page 7, it's related to upper concentration limits and waste material, particularly manufactured coal gas waste, that the UCLs would be applicable to that material. We've had cases where you had the coal gas waste, but that wasn't evaluated in the risk characterization because it wasn't in soil per se, so it was left out. So this is to address that interpretation. It also adds that the visible presence of MGP waste in soil or sediment be a screening criteria for the ecological risk characterization. Joe?
Can we talk about that one a little bit?
Yeah.
So am I interpreting that as you're looking for samples of waste material? And what are there any MGP wastes in particular that you're concerned about? Because there can be many types of MGP wastes, coal tar or purifier box waste or ash. I guess I'm trying to understand, is it a distinction between taking a coal tar impacted soil sample versus a more pure waste sample itself and comparing that to UCLs? The more I think about it, the more it kind of unpacks is like, typically you take a site-wide average concentration of soil compared to UCL. This sounds like you're looking for a sample of waste material that you would compare to UCL. I'm just curious about the domino effects, I guess.
I think that's what we were looking for. So you would be sampling that as well for looking at what your concentrations are, your site-wide averages are.
So is the proposed change that there would be an average for waste material compared to UCLs and an average for soil compared to UCLs, or an average for sort of solid stuff compared to UCLs? Just wondering if it'll have to be that explicit in order for you to get what you're looking for.
Nancy, did you hear that comment, and do you have any comment? Was the proposed change that you would have an average for the MGP waste and then an average for the soil, or would they
anything that's solid gets compared?
Anything solid is compared to UCL's by itself?
Right now there's a soil UCL and there's a groundwater UCL, so we need either a UCL that's explicit, like this is waste UCL and an average to compare to it, or it's a solid and it's a water or something.
This is intended for just waste, a sample of waste, because we're seeing sites where there's extensive deposits of waste that are not being really included in the risk assessment in any appropriate way because it's not soil, it's waste.
Understood. So my comment is just that in order to address that, the language needs to be clear about, right now the language is a soil, it's an average soil concentration compared to a soil UCL. So just point being, it'll need to be really clear about what you're actually looking for to get that addressed.
So change it to like average solid.
Right, solid stuff.
Liquid
stuff that's not water.
Soil.
Yeah.
We have a question from the...
Can DEP clarify that the readily apparent harm for coal tar, MGP, and soil or sediment should be limited to the
What was the question?
Can you repeat the question?
Okay, there's a question that came in here that says, can DEP clarify that readily apparent harm for coal tar / MGP in soil or sediment should be limited to the biotic zone? And I don't think we really discussed limiting it in that way. I take this to mean that at a certain depth, it shouldn't be considered readily apparent harm. We haven't had that kind of limitation or talked about that kind of limitation, but that could be part of the discussions going forward.
So on this point of sampling actual waste material and comparing it to UCLs, I see that this is specifically commenting for MGP waste, but would that apply to? I mean, we're gonna we allow less than half an inch of NAPL remaining, and that's being clarified. Is there the expectation that waste material would need to be sampled, or if you have soil samples, but you can actually see DNAPL in a soil sample? Is that part of this expectation also? It's like if it's just written as waste material, that's very broad, and then all of a sudden we kind of are losing the context of the material in a matrix, and it's like you're pulling it out, and all of those examples will flunk UCLs.
Yeah, right. And they're not addressed in risk assessment.
There's potential implications here.
Yeah, I see that.
How homogeneous does the waste have to be a waste?
All good points. Yeah. Okay. We'll fix that. All right. Just maybe wrap up what's on this list here. Engineered barriers. I think we might have mentioned this before. I'm on the top of page 8 now. We added an option, an additional financial assurance mechanism option for public entities, people who operate on budgets and have have the responsibility of maintaining these things as part of their obligations as the public entity. So other ways of getting assurance that they'll have the funds available to maintain the barriers. Permits, we did try to clarify a lot of the permit solution with no conditions, just with cross-referencing those different categories. Permit solutions with conditions, no AULs. We're gonna talk about this next. The consideration of whether we would have a category for that for high subslab soil gas levels. We've talked about that in this meeting before, but I'll save that for a few minutes from now. So we did a lot of tweaks to the IPM language with respect to telemetry and that registration process, and making it specific to shut down and restart, because as you'll recall, we've talked a lot about this, we kind of built those requirements as we went along in this past year or two. So now the regs really reflect more what we actually ask for in practice in terms of how those systems work. We're also going to talk in a minute about IPMs and private water supply wells. Remote telemetry is not applicable, doesn't work for that. So we need, if we want to keep that as something that you can have a permanent solution while treating a private water supply well, which I think we do, we need some way of kind of routinely monitoring and verifying that the treatment's being maintained. So I want to talk about options for that. Remedial additives and management of groundwater. We're going to talk about that as well. URAMs and post-permit solution. We're talking about that. So now I'm on page 10 of 11. Made some AUL changes. One is to, I think in practice this is already happening, but to eliminate the requirement for the registry copy of the plans because they're difficult to review and submit electronically, and DEP has access to them otherwise through the registry of deeds. So the regs will reflect that. We are putting specifically that AULs may be used for remedy operation status. We made a reg change that eliminated that appeared to eliminate that option. We didn't intend to do that. There's the addition of a signatory authority as Exhibit D to the Form 1075 where that's required to be provided. Just some more clarity about about terminations and just kind of reworking those sections to make them clear. I think this is a big one is on page 10, subpart N, the ability to provide written notices to local officials by emails. Yes. Put that in there. Yes. I think the next one is also probably significant in that the notice to property owners and affected individuals when you're addressing a CEP or IH. Right now, the property owners are already getting notice when you're sampling because we have that separate environmental sampling requirement. But affected individuals are only being notified in the event that you're actually going to take remedial action to address the condition. And we are proposing that that be expanded to also include the assessment activities once you have an IH or CEP condition. And also changing the wording in those cases where you're you're in a multi-unit building and you're posting that you're doing these activities. The current language of the regs is requests that the property owner post it, and we've changed that to require. Okay. think that's about it. Any of those, now that you've glanced at it, want to talk more about? Okay, so.
Liz, is it too late to add to this list?
No. I mean, depends how big it is. Yeah, it has to be skinny.
I just had a couple of scenarios that I didn't know whether or not that maybe I should I just email them or what would you?
Sure, yeah.
Okay.
I mean, anyone who, if you want to say, I didn't hear you say this, I suggested this before. I think this is a pretty comprehensive list of what we considered and included, but I won't say that I didn't miss things that we were told of. So.
You're reviewing New York on geolocation? It's pretty handy.
New York has geolocation.
Has for years now.
And when do they require it? All the time?
For your sampling location, you have to show geolocation of, when you're submitting your monitoring well data. It's part of your submittal package.
Well, so we've mentioned this several times. I've never heard anyone having any objections to this. Is that how we should view it?
It's just kind of handy. It gives you all kinds of neat tools like, hey, I'm at this site. Hey, I wonder if there are any data. Is there any data for wells around my site?
Is there anyone that doesn't do this now? Okay.
Right, we don't have a mechanism for.
We don't have a way to transmit it to you.
That would be.
We do it because we do it on our own CAD charts or something, but we never tell you.
Yeah.
So one in the slightly longer term projects, but that we've already started talking with our IT staff about, well, not our IT staff, the IT staff, is to develop or acquire a system that will allow us to geolocate well data, soil data, sediment data. So there is a process that has just started. So we are looking at New York for that. We're looking at we're looking at what NOAA has done as well. And yeah, the beauty of that, once we have a system by which we can take in that information and then spit it back out again, so that people can look at what concentrations are present in even over time, how it's changed over time. So that's the longer term goal. So we're beginning to put the pieces together so we can build those systems and acquire them. So this reg change, we have to balance kind of getting people to look at it. You already have the data for the most part, you're the geolocations, so it's a question of, it doesn't do us much good having it, I mean, it does do good having it in a report, but it's much better if that information is coming in electronically so that it can be displayed and used by us and by you as well. So that is the longer term project, but it means building out the data systems that would allow us to do that.
Liz, can you provide an update on the soil standards for PFAS in GW1 areas?
Nancy, can we provide an update? I don't know. Do we have the final numbers? We're still working on those.
For PFAS, we're still crunching the final numbers. So we don't have any specific numbers, and we're also kind of thinking about how best to present them. Whether it's, there's still a lot of things that are up in the air, and no final decisions have been made yet. So wait and see, hold your breath. But for in the GW1 areas, you might not be surprised to learn that one of the primary concerns with PFAS is leaching to groundwater. So we are looking at that pathway, and as you've probably seen looking at what other states have been doing, where that is of concern, the levels that are associated with leaching to groundwater from soil are significantly lower than those levels that are based on direct contact risks. I think that's fair to say, Nancy? So it would be lower, and certainly one of the things that we would normally do is take into account the reporting limits and the analytical limitations for measuring PFAS in soil, and take into account or continue to consider the options under Method 2 for where you can in fact demonstrate that there is not significant leaching to groundwater, that alternative cleanup numbers under Method 2 up to those direct contact standards would be appropriate. So it's still that same process.
Do you know why this cut out?
Yes, we turned it off.
Oh, okay. Well, we don't need it. We don't. So we can just switch now to that single sheet you have of discussion questions.
There's one more question. So there was a request online to hold a EPC meeting in the western region.
Nancy says yes.
Can you repeat that question so that I don't know?
So there was a request to hold an EPC meeting out west, probably maybe in addition to one here. So yes, do that. Okay, so first, permit solution with conditions, no AULs. Let's talk about this one first. We internally, Wayside Cleanup has discussed the option or the possibility, lamp approaching shutdown.
Oh, it just does that. Don't worry about it.
That's scary. Establishing a permit solution conditions category with no AUL for those situations where you don't have a current impact to indoor air, but you have the high subslab soil gas levels. The guidance goes into talking about how to view your soil gas levels and whether or not they would be considered high. Our discussions have been about the building in those cases acting as a barrier, and DEP is really of the mind that we don't think it's appropriate to create a permit solution with conditions category for this, for no AUL. Because the building is acting like a barrier in the same way other barriers that require AULs are, we think this is a significant enough issue that it really warrants the AUL documentation. So I wanted to circle back on that because we don't intend to include that as an option in this draft, to have this new permit solution with conditions category. We're also asked to look at whether VOCs in soil surrounding a building that aren't necessarily of concern for a pathway, or it's been ruled out, but they may become a concern upon redevelopment, whether that might be a possible permanent solution with conditions. We found that just to be there are too many complications with how that would kick in and when that would kick in to make that practical. So that's another one that we didn't think was appropriate. So I think the short answer is we don't have anything in this draft that would create any additional permit solutions with conditions with no AUL. The second thing, we wanted to review issues that might be coming up with the existing categories. Yeah.
I appreciate that you've reviewed that. I mean, that was something that was about putting a condition on. Basically, you still had soil gas samples effectively under a commercial building that you would need kind of AUL if you wanted to close it if you didn't use the residential soil gas.
Right. Or would be considered high of potential for future exposure.
And I guess I appreciate that you considered it, but you also have to really engage the community in those discussions in terms of trying to kind of understand what our experience has been under the kind of the new reg changes, and that's something that we still think would be kind of how it would play out on a practical basis.
Well, probably now is not sufficient time to do that. But do you want to speak to that a little bit about experience and how this might work?
I guess it's, you know, it's just it's something that, you know, I have been advocating for, and which is trying to be able to bring site closure on commercial properties that don't, as an alternative, have to be well, because you know it can be challenging, particularly when you have a site that affects properties that are not under the ownership of the PRP. But those, you know, those properties, that the sites can't be closed because the property owner won't agree to an AUL, even though, you know, the current conditions don't pose a risk. You know, I appreciate that the use could change in the future, but just like the, you know, the other GW2 standard, it kind of puts people on notice. And it keeps sites in kind of temporary solutions for a very long time.
Yeah, you know, the question I have is, how is it qualitatively different from the, you know, there is no building currently, and yet you exceed GW2? How is it different from saying that, you know, if we have conditions under a building and you're saying an AUL is required because we're concerned, Paul had mentioned, you know, they'll put in an elevator pit or somehow breach and change the construction of the building and therefore create a pathway. But I mean, how is that different than like building a building over an area where groundwater greatly exceeds GW2? How is it qualitatively different?
Well, I think some of the things in DEP's experience is it's already there, present under the building. So you know it's there. Our experience also is that it's not a rare situation where you have changes to the building and redevelopment of buildings. That's a relatively common occurrence. So it is a little bit different from building a building, you know, build a new building where you can put things in place and make that part of the construction plan. So if you know, and one way of kind of upping the potential that you know is to have it documented in activity and use limitation. One concern we have, and I think we, you know, permanent solutions with conditions, no AULs, I think that's a good solution. But there are developments that occur where people do not consult our records. They just don't.
I understand. I'm just saying, so for the new construction of the GW2 area, you regard conditions as being sufficient notification for doing all those things for that new construction, right?
True, but not all sites where levels are above GW2 will result in concentrations beneath the building. And in this case, we know we have that information that it's there.
I just want to clarify the issue that we're talking about a little bit, because I think there's two issues, and the guidance that was published a year ago makes one of these clearer. So that there are really two issues going on. One is what you're talking about, which is that the prior version of vapor intrusion guidance made it harder to close a site that was commercial than residential, because the guidance would not allow you to use current indoor air concentrations as a future EPC. It wouldn't allow you to use anything as a future EPC. And so the guidance has clarified that issue. So before that change to the guidance, you essentially couldn't close a commercial site, currently commercial site, without being below GW2, because the guidance offered you no way to develop an exposure point concentration. And that was one of the suggestions here, that would have been a helpful way to use a permanent solution with conditions, but without an AUL, and that, like, we got all this indoor air data, we got the soil gas data, everything looks fine, but but the guidance wouldn't allow us to develop an EPC, so we couldn't conclude no risk for future use. So the change to the guidance has addressed that, and I do think it's important that we distinguish the two things, because that was a real problem before, and now there is flexibility in the guidance. The issue that remains that you're concerned about is where you have indoor air data, but the soil gas data is way, 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 way higher. And nobody could agree that the slab itself is not acting as more of a barrier than is needed, and that's when you need an AUL. But I do think we need to distinguish this issue about change in use, where you have enough data to conclude that a change in use would be okay. That's now allowed under guidance without an AUL, versus what you're talking about, which is not only would a change in use be a problem, but a change to the floor would be a problem even for current use. So there are two different issues, both of which were not okay, where we didn't have a pathway to permanent solution under the previous guidance, but one of them now does. So it's not change of use, it's where change in slab would be a problem, that you're saying an AUL is still needed. But you can, under the current guidance, demonstrate that a change of use could be okay and still get a permanent solution. Anyway, they're two different issues. And one was not okay before, and now it is, without a reg change.
Is there anything in what you just described that you see as something that would be suitable for a permanent solution with conditions that didn't have an AUL?
So before the guidance change, a place where I would have liked to see a permanent solution with conditions with no AUL is a commercial building where you can demonstrate through indoor air sampling and soil gas that even if the use of the building were to change to residential, that you wouldn't have a significant risk for future use. Now the guidance allows you to do that, so I don't think you need a reg change anymore. But before, the guidance was explicit, you just can't have a future EPC, it's impossible to predict. So I don't think you need it anymore for that change of use issue. Anyway, that's part of what you're talking about, so I just wanted to clarify that they are separate issues.
But I also think Jan's point is well taken, which is, if you were to write a permanent solution with conditions, you need to provide it to, I'm talking, let's say, about, for an example where PRP doesn't own the property, so it's on adjacent property. You would still need to provide that to a property owner. So, that's providing them notice of this condition. So, and that's what a GW2 standard does. The condition does, it just provides notice. It can just be very hard to get somebody to write an AUL on it.
The conditions that Liz is talking about now are similar to, like, if there were lead in soil and it wasn't covered, there would be a risk. That's what we're left with here. So if there's CVOCs under your slab and you remove the barrier, there would be a risk. And so that's the group that's left, and that is consistent that would be documented in an AUL.
Which we view as being analogous to
right.
any other barrier you would
but
have.
It's different than if there were a change of use and you're simply not allowed to evaluate it, which was the way the guidance was written before, and where I think this would have been helpful, where you could say a permanent, but it's not necessary anymore because the guidance addresses it. But they're different things.
Well, that was helpful to me. So I agree, Eileen. We have kind of been saying we're going to talk about this. We're going to talk about this. So I'm reporting back that DEP did talk about this when we were putting the draft together, and this is the view we took of it. I don't know if you still have concerns about whether we've spent enough time on that, but we're proposing not to put any additional categories of permit solutions with no AUL, with conditions.
What I just heard, so you're not going to allow an additional condition for a building with elevated soil gas? It's going to stay the way it is.
Right. Where it is considered high, where it has the potential, where it's really the building is the barrier over those levels.
Above and beyond what we
A condition is not a sufficient notification, requires
probably won't have, it'd probably be difficult to have a real discussion of this, but this is all new, these permanent solutions with conditions, no AULs, and these categories. We have guidance on BMPs for gardening. We have draft guidance on anthropogenic background, so maybe there are fewer issues there. We're just kind of putting out a call for any input on clarifications that might be related to the application of these conditions. Sure.
Can you use the mic?
Yeah.
Oh.
So if there's a site that doesn't have a building on it because it is a site and groundwater concentrations exceed GW2, I'm still not sure why you don't need an activity and use limitation. If the owner of the property wants to develop the property but can't because remedial activity is going on, and the PRP files a permanent solution with conditions but no AUL, the property owner really is at the mercy of the PRP. They don't have to sign off on an activity and use limitation, but effectively the use of the property is limited.
You're imagining a scenario where
Oh, I'm not imagining.
I'm not. You're thinking of a scenario.
You're describing this.
You're thinking of a scenario where the PRP is a different party than the property owner.
Correct.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's a valid point where the AUL forces a negotiation, and this reduces the sort of agency of a non-PRP property owner. That's fair.
I've had negotiations and they're going up to 97.
Right. I mean, it's more explicit now that it's a loophole. It's always been a loophole. It's now more explicit that it's an intentional loophole.
I guess, well, if they were to move to develop the property, that could force the issue in terms of potential for new exposures. But that's not the best way to kind of move that issue along. That's pretty
And it
complicated.
puts the responsibility potentially on the property owner because they're the one. They don't have any way other than suing somebody to get the PRP involved.
I think they would have known about it and doing due diligence before they bought the property.
No, they own the property. They own the property.
This could be a typical DPS situation. Yeah.
Could be a municipality.
Right?
Right.
Your argument, though, was that if they're doing new construction, they have the opportunity at the time of doing new construction to put in some slab or whatever they need to do at relatively marginal cost in the new construction. Really?
The people online were complaining that they can't hear everybody, even you.
A building could have been demolished because there was contamination.
So this is a real world example that's actually is happening. Yeah, I can see that.
More discussion.
And not uncommon. I mean, that's pretty common scenario.
That you should remove the flexibility that you don't need an AUL?
Yes.
Well, it's flexibility when viewed from the off-property upgradient PRP's point of view. It's, if you're viewing it from the downgradient property owner point of view, it's a lack of control, lack of...
It's something that can just be imposed on you.
Yes.
But I thought...
Unwanted flexibility.
I thought that provision in the last set of regs was to get around where does GW2 apply? does it apply everywhere, or does it just apply where there's a building? And I thought that was the sort of the fix, so that when you didn't have a building, you'd have a condition.
That's correct.
Well, it does.
But the
So,
point,
so if you take it away, you get back to where does GW2 apply again?
Well, we make GW2 a universal cleanup standard.
Right.
Yeah.
But that's, been found to be unreasonable for many years. Not in Connecticut. This isn't Connecticut.
Michelle, in your situation, are you talking about the property owner, I'm sorry, that the property owner is not the PRP, the PRP perhaps is an operator of the site? Is that the situation? Not downgrading property status.
Right.
So in that situation, and I've encountered this before, so in that situation, I think your concern is that the permanent solution with conditions kind of takes the property owner out of the loop, and the property owner is left holding the bag. So is another way to handle this is to put something in the regs for this situation that says that if the PRP is not the property owner, then they have to get an agreement from the property owner before implementing this. I mean, something to protect the property owner. I think it's a valid point.
If the PRP, I'm not involved in one of these situations, so I don't have an axe to grind. If the PRP meets the regulatory standards and you give the other party a veto right, then the leverage goes too far in the other direction.
But the problem is that this PRP doesn't own the property, but yet conditions are being implemented on the property that the property owner has no control of. I think that's your point. I think it's a well taken point.
But does an AUL make that better for downgrading property owners?
it forces a conversation.
It forces the conversation.
Yeah.
It forces because
Or decide a temporary solution, you'll end up in the same spot.
Right. Whereas a permanent solution with conditions, he doesn't.
So under the current regs, just so we're clear, kind of where we are now and where we might be going. Under the current regs, if you have a building, the area around the building is GW2 because there's an occupied building structure there. A plume goes to a neighboring site. There is no building there now, so under the current rules, this would be GW3. You meet the GW3 standards, you close. So from a...
Would it also be DPS?
Well, but if it's meeting the GW3 standards, they wouldn't need DPS because there's no down here. There's no notification trigger. It's part of the site. It's already part of the site, and it's as long as this plume is meeting GW3, then you could have a permanent solution as is because this is not GW2.
The DPS part isn't important, but they could still have downgrading property status because they could still have RC exceeding status, but meet GW3. And like whether they elect to file downgrading property status is irrelevant.
There are a lot of variations on the possibilities here, but in its simplest.
But it might not be a downgrading property. It is, in this particular case, it could be the site itself. There was a former operator, the building was demolished, the owner is now left with this piece of property that's vacant that would be in productive reuse, but for the fact that it's a site. And now the PRP can file a permanent solution with conditions, leave, and leave the property owner with that added burden of having to, do additional work there, or to have the added expense of having to plan for any kind of vapor intrusion, which.
How did an AUL change that?
Because if the property owner had to sign on to the AUL, then they could make it a condition that, you provide some kind of escrow agreement that would cover that additional cost burden.
Sue the PRP to get their money anyway.
I think to the point, the point is, it seems to throw, as to Mike's point, all the advantage one way or the other. If you do it with conditions, all the advantages in the favor of the RP and against the property owner. If you put the AUL, all the advantage goes to the property owner instead of the PRP. And this was a great advantage because it did help PRPs get sites closed, but to the disadvantage of property owners.
On the other hand,
that's not the right way to interpret that. The sites would have been closed as a GW3 site.
This wasn't a change.
This basically put on notice for somebody who might be developing something in the future. They need to be concerned about vapor intrusion. The site was closed with actually less stigma on it.
Exactly. If you're trying to close a site, the banks are going to look at a permanent solution much better than a temporary solution, or there's an AUL. I mean, there's a benefit to getting a permanent solution even for the property owner.
But the developer's still going to have that cost of those conditions.
He wants to build a building. He's changing the uses, I mean,
but if we didn't have the GW2 condition before that, what was it, 2014?
Right.
He could have demolished the building, and he no longer had a building on the site, so he could have closed the site. You kind of would have been in the same place.
Yeah, she's just saying she doesn't think it's enough, regardless.
Right.
It's not a function of the 2014.
That's
I think it's a gap.
Well,
It's not worse, but it's not good enough.
That's it, yeah.
Well, frankly, we all, as a community, hold you guys back from putting AULs on every property in the state.
Right.
So this was the compromise position from that, if I am remembering history.
Right.
AUL was still viewed as an encumbrance on the deed, so you don't have it. It's still a benefit to the property.
Was and is.
There's no.
And contamination on a property should be viewed as a problem as well. Well, as an opportunity and an opportunity. A problem and an opportunity. One of the things I've certainly have been wary of is kind of we're 20 plus years into this is reaching the point in many cases, I'm not saying this is one of them, of having specific unique examples that then we try to cover the 99th percentile value. I think in general the regs work for most of the sites, and a lot of what we're talking about when we have discussions like this are kind of the unique problems that we encounter over the years that it doesn't quite fit in for this, and it's not necessarily satisfying what the options are for this dwindling, more narrowly defined universe of problematic situations. Suing is certainly one option. Putting AULs on all the properties is another option. I'm not saying either one of those is good. One thing you could throw out there is, this gets to the question of what is the future use of a property, and something to throw out, and I don't think it's necessarily for this reg change, because I'm just throwing it out there, is there are situations specific to this case where if you had a building there where are we? A former building there that was torn down, perhaps even in order to facilitate remediation, then is that in itself an indication of likely redevelopment and likely future use? And could you equate a demolished building as likely further redevelopment, which would distinguish it from the plumes moving into into virgin areas where there hasn't been development in the past?
There were a bunch of public policy ways to handle this. I mean, so one of the issues I ran into in New York was, in order to get your building permit, it doesn't matter. You have to put in the sub-slab components of vapor intrusion mitigation regardless, because they're saying something could always happen in the future. So as long as you're building a building, you might as well do it at that time. And they just fold it into the building permit program instead of remediation.
Yeah. Unfortunately, we don't control the building permit program.
Right.
Yeah, but that's certainly consistent. That's certainly consistent with the way EPA is looking at things. Right. If you're building new buildings, protect it against vapor intrusion. Period. Because you might not have a plume now, but you might in the future.
I've had, in the case of the building was demolished and that may mean they're going to develop it, I've had sites where they demolished the buildings to build a parking lot because the property is more valuable as a parking lot. So
Or a park.
Yeah. Or a park. At least with parks, you might then get into like dedicating it as a park. And,
so you can't necessarily
Yeah,
say
they all
that.
Brownsville's parks.
So we're in the interest of ending this meeting. That's my interest. We still have 3 issues. Just tell you if you want to send me any comments related to those issues. One is on post-permit solution activities. Right now, those regs are really written primarily focused on the management of soil. We want to make it more explicit that managing contaminated groundwater, remedial wastewater would fall under those. But I just sense that there might be some issues or questions that come up with that. So if there are questions you have, like what would be the thresholds, or should there be some thresholds, or
Remember, there's the RGP.
That's right.
Permits,
Right.
programs. So if you're dewatering or have you effluent on a contaminated site or a formerly historically contaminated site,
It's regulated.
It's regulated. It's regulated by the RGP.
but the plans related to doing that are related to doing your post-permit solution work. I think this is mostly the case where you're managing it in addition to what you're doing with soil. I don't think you're ever just managing groundwater, but am on a construction activity. Yeah. Right. So, okay. So I just want to flag that that I just suspect there might be things that should be considered there. So we can put the reg out and you can tell us later, or if you want to flag things ahead of time. What was the other one? Remedy operation status, people that fall out of remedy operation status, it's terminated. We kind of have a policy, I think it's best described as a policy that you really get 1 or maybe 2 bites of the apple if you're the person that filed the original remedy operation status, but the remedy it wasn't up to what it needed to be to maintain it. So there are some questions about what the path back is and whether the reg should say more about that. So that's just a general, if you want to weigh in on that. And then what was the last one? Oh, URAMs in addition to RAMs when you're doing post-permit solution activities. I think that's something that people would find very beneficial. I think it could be very easily done with cross-referencing. I think we originally didn't do that. Maybe one because we just didn't see it, but also there was some concern that when you're running through an AUL area, the parties performing URAMs might not be of the same mindset as somebody developing a property and using a construction RAM. Whether they'd be as diligent as identifying what they needed to do. But an LSP is involved in both cases. I don't think that should be an issue, but we just wanted to flag that we're likely to make that change, but if you want to identify anything related to that as well. So that's it in a nutshell. So if you think of anything, feel free to send me an email. And we'll be moving forward. And if we meet in November, which we probably, well, maybe we won't. That's Thanksgiving holiday. Yeah. So. What? Yeah. Yes, we'll be having a post-dinner discussion at my house. So we haven't made this decision yet, but it's likely we won't be meeting again until December or around the holidays. Yeah. Maybe split the difference. We'll try to make that meeting earlier part of December. Find a time for that.
Yeah,